Alien Princess was caged in the Cryochamber and human Defrosted her during battle. The warship Resolute Dawn shook as another barrage of plasma shells tore through its aft defenses, alarms howling like wounded animals in the choking corridors. Lights strobing between red emergency pulses and the dark void left when power circuits fried under the relentless assault. And in the middle of that chaos staggered Lieutenant Ethan Cole, his breath ragged inside his helmet as the rebreather rasped stale oxygen against his faceplate, every step of his boots clanging against steel plates that trembled under the assault. From outside, and though he had trained for combat boarding, for hull breaches, for the madness of war in orbit, nothing had prepared him for the madness of the dying Resolute Dawn. A ship that had once been a proud carrier of the Terran Defense Fleet, but now resembled a carcass being stripped by vultures of the void, and Ethan, separated from his unit by a sudden hull collapse, found himself sprinting through unfamiliar maintenance corridors, guided only by the desperate instinct to survive and the flicker of his HUD map which crackled and fizzled with static interference. Half of the overlays dead from EMP bursts, his comms channel shrieking with background distortion and the broken fragments of voices friends, comrades cut off mid-scream. He forced himself deeper into the ship, away from the breached outer decks where vacuum clawed at steel, knowing that anywhere near the external hull meant death, and as he stumbled into an auxiliary bay sealed by blast doors that had long since lost their markings, he slammed his palm against the manual override, forcing the gears to grind open inch by inch until a stale hiss of preserved air washed over him, thick with the bite of coolant and old metal, and he stepped inside, sealing it behind him, plunging himself into a silence that felt heavier than the gunfire outside, broken only by the dull rumble of distant explosions vibrating through the bones of the ship. His helmet lights swept across the bay, revealing rows of storage crates, broken conduits spilling wires like entrails, and in the center an object that stopped him cold. At first, Ethan thought it was just another coolant tank or medical pod, the sort you saw in long-haul carriers, but as he stepped closer, brushing away the frost that clung to the glass, his chest tightened. Inside, suspended in pale blue cryo-fluid, was a figure unlike anything he had ever seen, delicate yet commanding, her form slender but inhumanly graceful, skin faintly luminous as though the cryo-field itself refracted light around her, features sharp, elegant, undeniably feminine but not human, and her hair, if it could be called that, floated around her head like strands of liquid silver caught in starlight. His training screamed at him to step back. Protocols dictated that unidentified biospecimens in sealed cryo should remain untouched, particularly in the middle of combat, but something about the sight of her held him captive, an odd stillness. Amidst chaos, and against all rational instinct, his heart beat faster, not in fear, but in an inexplicable pull, a magnetism that made the thought of leaving her behind unbearable. Ethan forced himself to scan the chamber, his HUD tagging the device with no recognized Terran designation. No military registry, its core humming faintly with alien energy signatures his suit could barely interpret, and yet the readouts were stable, showing the occupant alive, suspended, trapped. He thought of the slaughter outside, the corridors littered with burning bodies, the way the Resolute Dawn was slowly being torn apart from the inside out, and something in him snapped. The soldier who followed orders fell quiet, and the human who refused to let another soul die in silence took over. He stepped to the console embedded in the Cryochamber's side, his gaunted fingers brushing across alien glyphs that pulsed faintly in response. The language unreadable yet strangely intuitive, as though designed to be felt rather than deciphered. And for a heartbeat he hesitated, every survival instinct screaming that releasing her could be catastrophic. She could be a weapon, a prisoner, a threat hidden away for good reason, but another detonation rocked the bay, the bulkheads shrieking. As metal groaned, and in that split second the choice made itself: die with the weight of obedience, or live with the chance of defiance. His hand slammed down on the central glyph. A shrill keening filled the chamber as the cryofluid began to drain, cascading out in shimmering streams, mist flooding the floor as frost cracked and shattered across the glass, and Ethan watched, unable to breathe, as the alien girl within stirred, her chest rising for the first time in what could have been decades, her eyelids flickering open to reveal eyes that burned with a light unlike any human's, a soft, radiant glow that seemed to cut through the dim bay like twin stars. She coughed, a sound fragile yet piercing, her hands pressing against the glass, and Ethan reached out instinctively, fumbling with the release as steam poured between them, until at last the chamber hissed open with a release of pressure that nearly knocked him back, spilling her forward into his arms. She was cold, so cold it burned his skin through the layers of armor but alive, trembling violently as if every nerve in her body fought against the shock of awakening, and Ethan, without thought, wrapped his arms around her, steadying her against him as alarms began to wail again, this time from the pod itself, readings flashing across his HUD in a storm of incomprehensible data. She gasped for breath, words spilling in a language he did not understand, melodic yet fractured. And her grip on his armor was shockingly strong, desperate. For a moment they simply stared at each other, two beings from worlds apart, the battle outside forgotten in the stillness of that gaze, until the next impact ripped through the ship, sending both of them crashing to the floor. Ethan shielded her with his body, feeling the bulkhead crack overhead, sparks raining down, and he realized with a jolt of terror and clarity that whatever she was, whoever she was, she had been hidden here for a reason, and now, by his hand, she was awake. The bay doors shrieked as enemy forces breached a nearby corridor, the sound of boots and weapons clattering through the smoke, and Ethan's rifle was already in his hands, his mind torn between the insanity of protecting this fragile stranger and the bitter reality that he had just made himself a target from every faction fighting for control of the Resolute Dawn. Yet when she looked at him again, her glowing eyes wide with confusion, fear, and something else, something like trust, Ethan knew there was no turning back. He had freed her, and in doing so, bound himself to whatever storm she carried inside. The alarms had not stopped since the moment the alien princess had opened her eyes inside. The ruined Cryochamber and the human had pulled her free with trembling hands, her frozen skin thawing beneath the emergency blankets he had wrapped around her. But now, as the second wave of battle shook the ship to its foundations and the bulkhead screamed with pressure strain, he realized that saving her was only the first step in a long chain of impossible choices that could either keep them alive or doom them both, and he had little time to decide which. The bridge was half destroyed and the crew were split into factions, some loyal to the captain who had authorized the cryokage and seen the alien princess as nothing more than a bargaining chip, and others secretly murmuring support for the human who had dared to defy orders, though none spoke it too loudly in the chaos for fear of being branded traitors. But down here in the maintenance deck, with sirens flashing crimson and smoke hurling through the vents, there was only the alien princess, pale from centuries of stasis, clutching his arm as though it was the only solid thing in a galaxy turned to fire. Her eyes, unblinking and strangely luminous, scanned everything with a kind of frightened clarity, and she asked him in a voice both broken and commanding what had become of her people, why she had been sealed in such a prison, what war had unfolded in her absence, and though he wanted to shield her from the truth, he knew he could not. So he told her that her empire had fallen, that most had believed her extinct, and that the human fleets had fought the remnants of her kind for generations until peace was replaced by bitter attrition. The words cut through her like shrapnel, but she did not collapse. She straightened, regal even in weakness, and said if even a fragment of her people remained she must find them, that she would not let her line end as a frozen relic in a human cage. He admired her strength yet feared her resolve, because the ship was not hers to command, and already the captain had broadcast across the decks that the human who had tampered with secured cargo and defrosted a dangerous prisoner was to be arrested on sight, while the alien princess was to be returned to containment dead or alive if necessary. And hearing this order echo through the coms, the human tightened his grip on her hand and told her to run. They weaved through corridors that were no longer corridors but battlefields in miniature, doors warped, fires licking at oxygen lines, men and women shouting at one another over which orders to obey, and as they ducked into the hydroponics bay, To hide among shattered glass and drifting leaves, he explained his plan to reach the hangar, steal a shuttle, and break free from the slaughter around them. The alien princess listened, her gaze sharp despite exhaustion, and then surprised him by insisting that if they left now, they would not only abandon potential allies, but also doom themselves to be hunted without reprieve, that the captain would brand them fugitives across every human channel. And she proposed something he had never expected. They should not flee yet, but instead reach the communications, relay and broadcast her survival to the galaxy to reveal to both human and alien remnants that the princes of the fallen empire still lived, so that the war could no longer be fought in ignorance. He argued that such a move would only escalate the conflict, that it would mark her as a beacon to every enemy faction eager to exploit or destroy her. But she countered with a simple truth that hiding had been her fate for centuries in ice, and she would not return to it now. Their whispers were cut short by the thudding of boots outside, armed patrols searching the deck, and he realized they could not linger, so he guided her through maintenance shafts and vertical ladders until, at last, they reached the comms hub, but what they found there chilled him more than the Cryochamber ever had. The captain himself stood in the center of the hub, flanked by loyal guards, and when his eyes met the humans there was no hesitation. He raised his blaster and ordered the alien princess to surrender, his voice thunderous above the crackling circuits, declaring that her blood had already cost too many lives and would not cost another. The alien princess did not flinch. Instead she stepped forward, chains of frost still clinging to her skin, and with words heavy with grief and authority, she demanded the captain listen, that she would not be treated as a weapon or a bargaining piece, that if humanity had any honor left, they would not repeat the crimes of locking her away. But the captain's jaw tightened, and he said there was no room for honor in survival, that her kind had burned worlds and slaughtered billions, and he would never allow her freedom to unleash another wave of destruction. At that moment, human moved between them, shielding her, his blaster trembling in his hand as he defied once more the man who had raised him from cadet to pilot. And he said that this was not justice, but vengeance, that the war could not end if they kept repeating the same chains and cages. Tension hung in the air like a drawn blade until the ship lurched violently from an external strike, throwing all to the ground, and in the confusion, the human dragged the alien princess toward a console, powering it with sparks, and told her to speak, to send her voice across the void before they were silenced forever. Her words poured out in alien cadence translated through the system, reaching frequencies beyond human range, calling to any who still remembered her name, promising that she lived and would not allow the galaxy to rot in endless war. And as she spoke, the human could see guards hesitating, weapons lowering slightly, as if something in her voice reached beyond propaganda. The captain roared for them to be stopped, lunged forward, but the human held him back long enough for her to finish, for the signal to beam out into the stars like a flare of defiance, and only then did they flee again, alarms screaming louder. Because now both salvation and damnation had been unleashed by a single act. As they ran, the alien princess turned to him, eyes burning with both gratitude and fear, and whispered that they had crossed the point of no return, that the galaxy would come for them now. But together they might change its course, and though he knew the cost of such words, he nodded, because somewhere deep within he believed her. The ship groaned around them like a wounded beast, as alarms wailed and emergency lights painted the narrow corridors in sickly red, and the human could feel every vibration through his boots as though the vessel itself were crying out against what was happening within. Yet his focus was locked not on the chaos of systems failing or the enemies closing in, but on the alien princess who had once been nothing but a still form behind frosted glass, her life suspended in the cold grip of machinery until he had defied every order and every regulation to free her, and now she moved beside him, unsteady but alive, her every breath a fragile rebellion against the fate others had chosen for her. Her wide, luminous eyes flicking between the bulkheads that trembled from distant impacts and the human whose hand had pulled her back into life. And though exhaustion weighed heavy on him and his lungs burned with recycled air thick with smoke, He refused to falter because to falter now would mean not just failure but erasure, the kind of loss that could not be undone, the kind that would echo in his soul forever. The corridors twisted and snarled with locked hatches and scattered debris from ruptured conduits. But the human knew this ship like a second skin, and he guided the alien princes with the urgency of a man who understood that every second wasted was one closer to their capture, explaining in clipped whispers where to step, when to duck, and when to press against the wall as squads of armored soldiers thundered past searching for them, unaware that the very prize their captain had sworn to protect was slipping away beneath their noses. And as they moved, the alien princess studied the human with a mixture of disbelief and wonder. Her people had told her of humanity's cruelty, their selfish hunger for conquest and survival, yet here was a single human who carried none of the cold detachment she expected, who risked everything not for power or reward but because he could not stomach the thought of her imprisoned, frozen, silenced, and though she could not yet voice it, every fiber of her being was tethering itself to him in gratitude that went deeper than words. They reached the maintenance shafts that cut beneath the central decks. Cramped spaces meant for drones and engineers rather than fugitives, but necessity stripped away choice, and the human pressed his hand against her back, urging her into the narrow crawl space, his own shoulders scraping painfully against metal as he squeezed in behind her, his breath shallow as the shaft carried the sound of distant gunfire like a drumbeat of urgency. And in that closeness, in the suffocating dark where the only light came from a flickering wrist display, the alien princess whispered her first true words to him since awakening, words that trembled but carried a steel beneath them. Why save me when it costs you everything? And for a moment, the human was silent, because how could he explain that in the instant he saw her frozen behind glass, he saw not just a prisoner but a person, a life stripped of agency, and in her reflection, he saw every injustice that had ever hollowed him, every order he had followed that left him ashamed. And finally he said in a voice rough but steady, because someone had to, and those words, simple as they were, anchored her in a way she had never expected, because in her world of emperors and generals no one did anything without calculation or gain. Yet this human acted from a truth raw enough to ignite something she thought lost to her kind trust. The shaft spat them out into an auxiliary bay where the human ship waited, scarred from battle, but still holding together, and he almost collapsed at the sight because every detour, every narrow escape had been leading here, yet before they could rush aboard, a squad burst from the shadows, rifles raised, armor gleaming with the insignia of the fleet that had caged her, and the human shoved the alien princess behind him, his blaster in hand, though he knew the odds were bleak, 5 against 1, and his weapon half-charged at best, yet something fierce lit his veins because surrender was not an option. And with a roar that was more defiance than sound, he opened fire, forcing the squad to scatter, buying precious seconds for the alien princess to act. And she did, her voice cutting through the chaos, resonant in a way that seemed to shake the walls, commanding them to stop, because though she was weakened, she was still of royal blood, still heir to a legacy they had sworn to protect even as they betrayed it. And her words struck them like a forgotten memory of loyalty, halting them just long enough for the human to press forward, disabling their weapons with precision, not killing but disarming, because he knew she would not want needless blood spilled in her name. They stumbled aboard his ship together, sealing the hatch as klaxons screamed, and he dropped into the pilot's seat, hands flying across controls, engines groaning to life even as enemy fire raked across the hull, the alien princess clutching the armrest beside him, her gaze steady on the stars beyond, and as the ship lurched free of the bay, pursued by frigates far larger and faster, she whispered something in her language, a prayer or a vow he could not understand, yet he felt the weight of it in his chest, a promise that she would not let his sacrifice be in vain. The chase was merciless, beams tearing through the void around them, shields buckling under the onslaught, and the human's every nerve burned with the strain of outmaneuvering ships designed for war with nothing but instinct, grit, and desperation to guide him, yet every time his resolve wavered, he glanced at the alien princess and found strength renewed because she was not frozen anymore. Not silent, not caged, but alive and free beside him, and that was worth every risk. At last, with engines screaming, he dove into the asteroid belt on the edge of the sector, weaving through rock and ruin at impossible speed. The enemy unable to match his reckless precision, and one by one they fell back, unwilling to follow. Into the chaos, until silence once more filled the cockpit, broken only by the rasp of his breathing and the quiet sound of the alien princess releasing a breath she had held for what felt like an eternity. They floated there, suspended among drifting stone and shattered stars, and in that fragile quiet, the human turned to her, sweat streaking his face, his body trembling from exhaustion, and asked softly, almost fearfully, "Are you safe now?" And she looked at him with eyes that glowed even in the dim light, eyes that held centuries of lineage and pain, yet also something tender. And she reached out, her hand brushing his, her voice carrying both gratitude and something deeper. "I am, because of you." And in that moment, both understood what their escape had truly forged. Not just survival, but a bond that defied empires and wars, a bond born in defiance of chains, of frost, of silence. A bond that would echo long after ships burned and captains fell, and as the stars wheeled before them, they set their course. Not for safety, but for freedom, together, human and alien princes, fugitives, allies, something more. And though the future loomed uncertain and perilous in that cockpit in that instant, they knew they had already won, because she would never again be caged, and he would never again walk alone.